Hey everyone, I'm here to do a video response for week 4. We're specifically going to be looking at Texas versus Johnson and US versus O'Brien and the implications that both of these court cases had on us evolving what we actually determine as speech versus just an act of conversation or something like that. First, specifically, when we look at Texas versus Johnson, it was a question of flag defamation and if we can do things like flag burning legally and if it's protected underneath the First Amendment. We see that the end of the day, it is decided that flag burning is protected because of symbolic speech. But what we actually have to look at are things like the dissenting opinions that provide context that have been cited later on throughout US society and how we actually decide how these things are followed. Specifically, when we look at dissenting Justice Rehnquist, what they actually cite first and foremost is that Rehnquist is more using emotional arguments versus intelligent arguments. They're using quotations and from the national anthem and specific pieces of poetry to back up their dissenting opinion by saying that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that this is not a form of speech. And actually, Justice Rehnquist says that flag desecration actually is an incitement of violence. This is where I fundamentally disagree with the justice because it isn't an incitement of violence unless they're doing it in a place in which they know people are going to attack them. When Johnson was acting, what it was a form of political protest in which they were put in a position where they felt like the only way for them to show how unhappy they were with the way that the government was working right now was to show by burning a flag. We can consider it to how we look at kneeling right now and how it is another symbol of which people are actually deciding that they want to show how upset they are with the way and the state of the United States federal government. What we say, though, and what we see, the criticisms of Justice Rehnquist are that they don't provide a test to separate the content and the medium of which something does and does not become speech. Basically, what this means is that they aren't giving us something like the lemon test to decide whether or not it is symbolic speech or whether it is not. Instead, what they do is they just say that this is probably a bad idea. Justice Rehnquist also cites the 1998 Flag Desecration Amendment, which ends up being failed because it is recognized as an opportunity for people to speak out and have symbolic speech. But then when we look at the US versus O'Brien case, what this one specifically is it's the burning of draft cards. And the decision that comes out is that it is not violating the First Amendment, even though it is knowingly destroying or mutilating specific government and federal property. We see that dissenting Justice Douglas cites specifically that government interest is only valid in the state of war when it comes to specific acts against government property. Now, O'Brien later says that they want to separate some of these issues and have the Supreme Court specifically rule on things like drafting during peacetime or drafting at the end of a war so that we have people to go in and do final reconnaissance and things like that. The justices decline this separation of issues, but what they end up really showing us is that at the end of the day, we can do what we need to in an act of symbolic speech. So the question does then become, why is it symbolic speech and when is it not? For me, I think it's a question of motives. If there's a specific motive behind doing something like burning a flag or burning a draft card, then it is then symbolic speech. But if there is no motive, what it actually then becomes is the opportunity for people to just be violent. Now, when we're looking at something like questioning a motive, it's incredibly hard to actually determine where there is and is not motive. So then we have to look at something like social responses and what the individual specifically says that they were working towards. If they're working towards something like a protest of the government, then what we have to recognize is that they have thought of this and it's giving them the opportunity to actually use something like a flag or something like a draft card to actually show that they're specifically unhappy with the actions that are being taken by the government. Now, a specific quote from Texas v. Johnson shows us that we have the freedom not to honor and even to defile things. And that shows specifically why the United States does continue to regulate symbolic speech as a portion of the First Amendment, because as much as we have the freedom to do something, we also have the freedom not to do something. So when we take a step back and we look at the question of symbolic speech, we have to recognize that most importantly, motives are going to be key to interpreting whether or not something is symbolic speech. They don't get to just burn something for sake of burning it without actually having a motive to do this. So when we look at Texas v. Johnson or U.S. versus O'Brien, what we look at specifically are the opportunities for people to dissent against what the government is doing. And even then, when we look at dissenting authors, they're not very clear on what their goals are when they're dissenting. They aren't providing appropriate outlines, and they're not actually supporting or making any statements specific to the issue. They're making vague generalizations about why the government should or should not be able to do this. So yes, symbolic speech is protected and should be protected as long as there is a motive that we can clearly discern and the opportunity to find specific issues that the motive is being responsive towards. Thanks, Joel.